appreciate all of you joining us today. We're holding this hearing virtually in compliance with regulations for remote committee proceedings. Um, we probably don't need to remind, but we should make it a part of the record, the procedures to help navigate the virtual meeting. Consistent with regulations, committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Members and witnesses must have their cameras on when present in the hearing. If you need to step away from the proceedings, please turn your camera and audio off rather than logging out. We will dispense with our practice of observing the Gibbons rule and instead go in order of seniority for questioning, alternating between minority and majority, beginning with members of the Trade Subcommittee. I really appreciate people's continued patience as I attempt to navigate this technology and as we continue serving our country together in this time of great need. With that, I will turn to the topic of today's hearing, supporting American workers, businesses, and the environment in the face of unfair Chinese trade practices. This hearing comes at a critical time and a fascinating time in the American-China trade relationship. Later next week, we will mark the 20th anniversary of China officially joining the World Trade Organization. I was one of the people who voted for it back then, believing that having China part of the WTO would moderate their behaviors. I think that there are real questions about that. The results of China's 2 decades at the WTO, to put it mildly, have left much to be desired. Instead of joining other market-based world economies, the Chinese have doubled down on its state-driven economic model. Economists now describe this phenomenon as China shock, which has had devastating and sustained impact on American workers and businesses across the country. 20 years later, China's approach has not changed. If anything, it's expanded. While the global economy is still dealing with steel and aluminum overcapacity caused by Chinese subsidies, China is doubling down on this approach with its Made in China 2015, which has expanded its industrial model to focus on key sectors of the future. More broadly, China continues to demonstrate that it refuses to play by the rules. China will exploit loopholes wherever they exist. We've given too much of a free pass to China over the years, and I sincerely believe it's time to take these issues seriously and take a more aggressive and assertive approach. The testimony of our witnesses today highlights some of these problems. Ms. Glass has noted the example of Shein. The Chinese company has developed a business model to exploit the de minimis provision in U.S. law to avoid paying any costs or go through oversight at the United States border, all of which undercuts American companies playing by the rules. And that was the subject of our roundtable yesterday. Shein is also part of a Chinese textile industry that benefits from deplorable treatment and forced labor for the Uyghurs and other minorities in the Xinjiang region of China. Lack of oversight at U.S. borders makes it even more difficult for CBP to intercept the shipments. We heard yesterday, just in terms of things shipped under the de minimis, it's 2 million packages a day in 2020. And one of our witnesses suggested that it may be as many as 6 million packages per day this year. These are areas of key interest to me, and I think the committee, which I would hope we can legislate on in the coming months. Dr. Mallory highlights another area where China continues to break the rules: fishery practices and subsidies. It's a similar story to other industries. China will take public steps to claim adherence to international rules and commitments, but through obfuscation and overall lack of transparency, it avoids taking meaningful action. It's strip mining our oceans and using what amounts to slavery in some instances. 20 years on, it's clear to me that China is committed to its state-driven economic model and that the United States must adjust our approach to effectively grapple with this reality. The Trump administration highlighted many legitimate concerns with China's trade practice, but its approach, as we all know, was haphazard, too chaotic to be effective. They refused to address labor and environmental issues in China and were entirely unsuccessful in addressing China's industrial policies. Equally troubling, the Trump administration went it alone, labeling our allies as national security threats and leaving them in the dark. The Biden administration has provided a breath of fresh air. Ambassador Tai, we all know and respect, has completed a thorough review of the China policy she was handed and is creating a rational and coordinated strategy. Importantly, the Biden administration is working with our allies to identify areas of convergence and to increase pressure on China with a coalition of concerned partners, a valuable tool that the Trump administration just refused to harness. There's much more that the administration must do on China, and I stand ready, and I believe the subcommittee stands ready to work with them to do so. As always, the key to effective and lasting U.S. trade policy is close and consistent coordination with Congress. Congress has taken action to respond to challenges posed by China. The Senate is working with the United States Innovation and Competitive Act, USICA, but the trade provisions in that bill are inadequate and fail to rise to the current moment, consistent with legislation that we've already passed. For one, USICA does not include meaningful provision on forced labor in Xinjiang. This is a critical defect. The House of Representatives has developed strong legislation that has substantial support among Democrats and Republicans. In addition, USICA's trade title includes GSP and MTB legislation without taking the opportunity to make key reforms. We've introduced legislation that makes critical and reasonable reforms to both programs that should be included in any reauthorization. I stand ready to work with members on China-related legislation, but we must address the issues we've identified above, take steps to address key issues like subsidies that the current bill fails to address. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on these issues as we consider ways to more effectively address unfair Chinese trading practices. With that, let me turn to my friend, the ranking member Vern Buchanan, for his opening comments. Vern, we appreciate your leadership and being with us and look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you, Chairman. And again, thank you for your leadership in convening this important hearing on the U.S.-China trade relationship. This is truly a bipartisan topic, and I appreciate the opportunity to take a subcommittee-wide look at this important relationship. And thank you to the witnesses today for taking their time testifying and getting their views. There's no doubt that China has cheated on trade for decades, and the United States has paid a steep price in terms of lost jobs and economic activity. Republicans and Democrats agree that China's predatory trade policies are unacceptable and harming American businesses and workers. Just to name a few examples of these egregious practices, they can include forced labor, IP theft, which I've known has gone on for 20, 30 years, massive subsidies, and excess capacity. That's why President Trump confronted China's predatory trade practices head on, resulting in the Phase 1 deal. Though the Phase 1 deal, the U.S. achieved unprecedented, meaningful enforcement results with China in a broad range of areas, including IP protections, agricultural standards and purchases, and financial services market access. I was glad to see the Ambassador Tai is committed to ensuring that China lives up to its end of the bargain. If China does not live up to its commitments, I strongly support swift enforcement action. I appreciate the fact that Ambassador Tai reinstated a product exclusive process for Section 301 tariffs. However, I'm concerned that this process has not gone far enough, and many improvements are needed as we look to the future. Our enforcement against China is stronger if we effectively target our tariffs to ensure that China, not the United States, experience the most effect of this process. While phase one addressed some significant unfair trade practices in China, it is no secret that there are many challenges remaining on the table with respect to China. That is why the Biden administration must implement a strategy to push China to make additional structural reforms. Republicans stand ready to work with the administration to force China to take additional steps to address its other trade distortion policies, including forced labor, industry subsidies, support for state-owned enterprises on non-commercial terms, cyber theft, and restriction on cross-border data flow. At the same time, the Biden administration must work closely with allies at the WTO and throughout the Indo-Pacific region to counter the effects of China's trade distorting industry policies. To do so, the administration must end its moratorium on trade negotiation and put forward an aggressive trade negotiating agenda that levels the playing field for Americans. Without Americans' leadership on trade, China will fill the void America leaves behind. Lastly, on pending China legislation, I will say that Republicans are eager to develop an effective strategy to confront China's threat and would welcome a thoughtful bipartisan process to develop House legislation to implement the strategy. There is already a solid framework for recommendation that the House Republicans developed together through the China Task Force, the majority of which have bipartisan support. I also note the good work that my colleagues, Representative LaHood and Miller, have done on the bill they've introduced this week to make sure Congress, and particularly this committee, is leading on developing an effective and strategic trade policy with respect to China. That strategy must include an ambitious trade negotiating agenda through the Indo-Pacific region. I also note that the Senate added a bipartisan trade agreement of 2021 to its China bill earlier this year by a vote 91-4. That includes many important components, including strong bipartisan renewal of GSP and MTB. I view renewal of both these programs as urgent priorities that will help our companies compete more effectively against competitors in China and elsewhere. Also, there are strong provisions requiring a meaningful exclusion process that is open to all Americans who are paying the Section 301 tariffs from China. Given that no process was even available for more than 10 months, retroactive relief is critical. I am concerned that there has not been a bipartisan process for considering China's legislation within the Ways and Means Committee today. I hope we can work together on this important legislation because ultimately the threat that China poses is one that affects all Americans, and it's critical that our response is thoughtful, strategic, and bipartisan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. I find your opening remarks encouraging, much of which I agree with, and look forward to working with you to implement them. With that,
thank you.
Let's turn to our witnesses. We appreciate these distinguished witnesses taking the time to appear with us today to help us guide through these matters. I will introduce the witnesses and in turn each of them for their testimony. Our first witness is Kimberly Glass, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Council of Textiles organization. Our second witness is Roy Hausman, Legislative Director for the United Steelworkers. Third is Dr. Tabitha Mallory, Affiliate Professor at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And fourth is Clete Williams, Partner at Aiken Grum. Each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety. We would ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less so we have more time for discussion. To help you with that, please keep an eye on the clock that should be pinned in the middle of your screen. If you go over time, I will gently notify you with a tap of the gavel. Now, let's turn to our first witness, Ms. Glass. You may begin.
Thank you. I'm honored to be before you today on behalf of the U.S. textile industry that employs 530,000 American textile workers and annually manufactures $80 billion worth of products. China continues to dominate the global textile and apparel market, including our US market, through illegal subsidies, rampant intellectual property theft, and other predatory trade practices. This has cost hundreds of thousands domestic jobs here in the United States and undermined critical production chains like PPE. If I were to offer one overarching recommendation today, we need to hold China accountable and ensure our trade policies are keeping pace to address the rapidly emerging predatory challenges we are facing from China and others. China's abusive environmental and labor record is on full display in our sector and has been well documented. China makes up 44% of US imports of textile and apparel products. 1 in 5 of our garments coming from China are made with forced labor from Xinjiang, with the worst human rights abuses imaginable. These items are bleeding into our supply chains and making it to our store shelves and into our closets. In fact, some of these products are making their way with the press of a button to our doorstep, utilizing Section 321 de minimis shipment loopholes that allow these products to come in duty-free, not just evading China 301 duties, but all duties altogether from China and elsewhere with little scrutiny by our US customs on these products. The trade tools are not keeping pace with this emerging problem. China's environment also has damaging implications. This sector contributes anywhere from 6 to 8% of our global greenhouse gas emissions because of these elongated production chains tied to the worst environmental practices. We are wearing our carbon pollution and environmental degradation. These predatory practices have not only harmed US manufacturers and workers, but also directly impacted our valued political and economic allies in the Western Hemisphere. For example, CAFTA-DR US co-production for textile and apparel that supports over 1 million jobs has been a critically important and deeply economically impactful agreement, despite the headwinds from China's increased access to our market during the agreement's existence. This is due to a key element of the agreement called the Yarn Forward Rule of Origin. This unique investment-based rule ties lucrative duty-free access to the US market and our consumers to ensure investment in yarn, fabric, and cut and sew production. Simply put, it means that the agreement requires that the signatories of the agreement gain the job benefits of the agreement. Onshoring and nearshoring are happening. Key CAFTA-DR countries are seeing exports up anywhere from 33 to 56%, outpacing even major Asian exporters, and more investments in yarn, fabric, and apparel production will be announced soon. A powerful counter to China's dominance in addressing the severe environmental and labor challenges we're facing is onshoring and nearshoring these critical production chains. Remarkably, as supply chain issues out of Asia are on the front page, some importers are seeking so-called relief, wanting to give Chinese yarns and fabrics in other countries who are not signatories to the agreement backdoor access to the CAFTA-DR market. These Trojan horse ideas must be rejected out of hand because they hurt US jobs, those in the region, and rewards other countries. There are proactive ways Congress can help unlock more investment in the US and the region through industrial expansion efforts, loan guarantees, and other incentives, and we are poised to work with you and the other committees on these priorities. Additionally, we largely support the Senate's USICA bill and various pieces of China legislation in the House. We note that some provisions in the Senate's USICA run counter to the bill's overall objectives and need to be addressed in the final China package. This includes the Stop PPE Taxes Act that suspends all tariffs on a range of PPE for an extended period of time. This damaging provision would cement China's dominance of global PPE production for years to come. We also urge Congress to pass the MTB immediately to help our US manufacturers compete in the global marketplace and make the MTB duty relief retroactive. The MTB is a powerful tool to level the playing field in global sourcing for inputs that are not made in the US, but are used in our manufacturing processes. Beyond passage of the MTB this year, we urge the committee to review the detrimental trend of allowing finished products to enjoy MTB benefits because it benefits Chinese manufacturing at the expense of American and regional workers and industries. We also urge Congress to advance critical bills like the Brown-Portman bill sponsored, I believe, by also Congresswoman Sewell to update our trade remedy laws to respond more quickly to repeat offenders like China. We need to step up Xinjiang enforcement and give Homeland Security and CBP the tools necessary to effectively enforce it. We need to stand firm on Section 301 textile duties for textile and apparel products. We need to strengthen our Buy American practices for PPE and other essential products. We need to block GSP expansion for textile and apparel products, and we need to strengthen the enforcement of our FTAs to mitigate transshipment. There's a lot here that I said in my testimony today and detailed in my written comments, but thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today and the committee's attention to these critical matters.
Earl, you're muted.
Well, I was just praising Ms. Glass and her detailed material in her written submission. It has some really valuable context that's provided. We'll turn next to Mr. Hausman.
All right, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Roy Hausman, and I am the Legislative Director for the United Steelworkers, or USW. As the largest industrial union in North America, our members are an integral part of the manufacturing supply chain. We supply America with the goods that don't have to wait on a container ship, and the growth and rise of China as a global economic competitor has been watched and commented on by the union even before the U.S. voted to grant China permanent trade status in 2000. The U.S. government's approach to wrangle with China's economic policy since the U.S. granted PNTR status has veered from dialogue to tariffs. But for the union, our government's response still has not met the mark for the American worker. Let me provide for you some examples on how China's practices impact workers and how Congress can strengthen our country's hand by improving enforcement and improving our trade laws. Let's begin on forced labor. Earlier this year, USW Local 135L member Joe Rona testified at a Senate Finance Committee hearing on how forced labor in Xinjiang impacted him. Mr. Rona's testimony highlighted how his former employer, Ferroglobe, planned to expand into the solar supply chain, but less than a decade later, they idled a plant, causing 100 union members to lose their jobs, in part because around 80% of the solar supply chain is based in China. The failure of the Chinese government to live up to international norms, like ending forced labor, is really just a symptom of a larger problem that the labor movement has flagged for decades. And while the 301 tariffs were really about forced tech transfers and IP theft, they also highlighted multinational corporations' reliance on China's manufacturing. Anti-competitive, non-market conditions combined with worker rights violations still exist in China, and we cannot accept that solving forced tech transfers and getting the country to buy more U.S. goods justifies a blind eye to China's actions towards Hong Kong protesters, an independent labor movement, the Uyghur ethnic group, or other violations of international norms. Turning to the U.S.'s trade defense mechanisms, where USW has participated in over 100 anti-dumping and countervailing duty, or AD/CVD, investigations, it's important to note that China represents 1 in 3 trade enforcement cases. Each of these cases represents not just violation of international law, but lost production, lost wages, lost jobs, and millions of dollars in litigation costs for U.S. companies and workers. Meanwhile, countries and companies are getting more sophisticated in their efforts to evade tariffs and AD/CVD orders. That is why the USW is supportive of updates to our trade enforcement language, like the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0 by Rep. Sewell and Johnson and Senators Brown and Portman. The legislation takes critical steps to address deficiencies in our AD/CVD process. Related to tariff enforcement, I must point out that earlier this year, an investigation by Customs and Border Patrol found not only circumvention of aluminum extrusion tariffs against China through the Dominican Republic, but also indicators of forced labor practices by the Chinese headquartered firm. The U.S. government must address labor abuses by Chinese firms in third-party countries and ultimately hold companies accountable for not just circumvention, but labor violations when trying to import into the U.S. market. Briefly on the 232 tariffs, the USW also sees the EU-US 232 arrangement as having promise in containing overcapacity in steel and aluminum, which is significantly fueled by China. The country represents over 53% of steel and 57% of aluminum production, much of it state-supported and carbon-intensive. The union urges Congress to support containing non-market steel and aluminum by supporting the 232 tariffs. Finally, the House and Senate will conference Senate Bill 1260, the United States Competition and Innovation Act. It provides a key opportunity to express our values and policy in regards to China. However, the last-minute Senate inclusion of the Generalized Systems Preference, or GSP program, creates concerns. I'll use tires, where USW is the largest union, as an example. My written testimony goes into detail on a number of GSP labor issues, but also highlights 3 Chinese-based firms building plants with capacity to ship over 27 million tires from GSP beneficiary countries into global markets, including the US. Why should we give a tariff preference to state-supported Chinese firms in third-party countries? USW looks forward to working with Congress to improve trade defense mechanisms and holding China accountable for its actions, both here in their home country and globally. And I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hausman. Ms. Malloy.
Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and members of the Trade Subcommittee, thank you very much for the opportunity to testify before you today, and good morning from Seattle. My name is Tabitha Mallory. I run a small consulting firm called the China Ocean Institute, and I teach at the University of Washington. I appear before you today to address how the United States can respond to China's policies on global seafood trade. Seafood is the most highly traded food commodity globally, and fisheries are important for global food security, economic livelihoods, and marine biodiversity. China is the world's largest producer, importer, and exporter of seafood. The country also has the largest distant water fishing fleet, which operates on the high seas belonging to no country and in the exclusive economic zones of other countries. China not only has a significant impact on global seafood trade, but also on global security because of illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing. These activities are associated with criminal activity, labor abuses, and environmental destruction. IUU fishing, which is as much as 1/5 of global catch, causes estimated losses of up to $50 billion annually. And also governments lose a lot of revenue through taxes, up to $4 billion a year. And China scored the highest in the world on one index measuring IUU fishing activity. Much of China's seafood trade consists of raw material that is imported into China for processing and then re-exported. China is both the top destination country for US seafood exports and the largest source of seafood imports for the US. But very little of this trade is tracked as re-export, which increases the risk of IUU catch or mislabeled product entering the US seafood supply chain. One way of mitigating this risk is by improving seafood traceability. The US Seafood Import Monitoring Program covers 13 species of fish, but the top 3 wild-caught imports from China into the US, pollock, salmon, and squid, are not covered. So we are still likely importing IUU catch from China. China does not have mandatory national standards for sustainable seafood traceability. The voluntary standards also do not track many key data elements. For example, the standards do not distinguish between country of origin and country of consignment. So after processing, the label can say it's a product of China, even if the fish was caught by a different country, like the US. Another significant challenge is proper customs categorization. China uses fewer harmonized system codes for seafood products compared to the US. HS codes are not standardized at the genus or species level and are not standardized across countries at the 8 or 10-digit level, making it impossible to preserve traceability across borders. I'll turn to fishery subsidies now. Subsidies skew the bottom line, making fishing more profitable than it would be otherwise. About 85% of China's subsidies were harmful in nature. And this is in 2019. China seems to have genuinely decreased domestic fuel subsidies, but it's been accompanied by a loss in transparency. China used to report fuel subsidies, but now the funding is given to lower levels of government to allocate and is no longer tracked at the central level. Subsidies are disproportionately higher for distant water fishing than for domestic capture fisheries. Even though distant water fishing accounted for only 22% of China's overall catch, distant water fishing received 42% of China's total subsidies and 49% of the harmful subsidies. And more of the support goes towards high seas fishing, which is largely unregulated. China increasingly provides subsidies for building distant water fishing bases around the world with the purpose of consolidating its distant water fishing supply chain. China is seeking special and differentiated treatment at the WTO negotiations as a developing country, even though China is responsible for the largest share of the world's capture fisheries, provides the largest share of fishery subsidies, and has crossed the World Bank developed country per capita income threshold. We need more transparency to address these issues in subsidies and trade data, fisheries access agreements, vessel monitoring system data, stock assessment data and information. And transparency is not only important for China, but also for the US and other major fishing nations. The US Seafood Traceability Program and trade data are optimized for regulatory traceability and compliance, but not for consumer or civil society information, so they're not public facing. Even though China produces the most seafood globally, developed entities like the US, EU, and Japan are still the world's largest consumers of seafood, so we also have an important role to play here. We also need to improve our management of high seas resources, and communication and cooperation with other countries is important, including sharing information, resources, and technology. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Very helpful testimony. And now, Mr. Williams.
Members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. As you know, China uses numerous unfair trade practices in an effort to supplant the United States as the world's economic and national security leader. This includes massive industrial subsidies, the illicit acquisition of sensitive technology, outright economic coercion, and more. This morning, I will outline a three-part framework to counter these practices and thwart China's ambitions. First, the United States must run faster, with policies that encourage growth in key technology sectors where we are competing with China. The bipartisan USICA bill includes numerous provisions to assist, such as funding for the semiconductor and 5G supply chains, a federal commitment to AI, quantum computing, and synthetic biology, and supply chain resiliency efforts. USICA would also spur growth and fight inflation by reinstating the miscellaneous tariff bill, the generalized system of preferences, and a China 301 exclusion process. This would lower costs for U.S. consumers and small businesses by billions of dollars and aid U.S. supply chain objectives. For example, increased tariffs on inputs and components have made it more difficult for companies to move manufacturing supply chains to the United States. The 301 tariffs in particular deserve attention. While in the Trump administration, I supported these tariffs to pressure China to stop its policy of forced technology transfer. However, they were not meant to be permanent, and some appear to be hurting the U.S. economy without providing the requisite leverage to change China's behavior. As such, the administration should consider whether more targeted tariffs would better achieve our goals at less cost. In the interim, we should reinstate previous exclusions and start a new process for all products. This shouldn't be a free pass to eliminate all tariffs, but at least give companies the ability to make their case to the Biden administration using their criteria. At the same time as we adopt policies to run faster, we must avoid ones that would slow us down, such as non-competitive tax rates or an anti-competition agenda targeting the very same U.S. technology companies that are competing directly with China's national champions. Second, the United States must adopt a robust defensive strategy to counter China's practices. If utilized appropriately, trade remedies, investment screening, and export controls can protect U.S. industry from harm and achieve national security goals. But if not well targeted or coordinated with allies, they risk unintended economic consequences and limited effectiveness. USICA also includes worthwhile defensive elements, such as directing USTR to focus on Chinese censorship and CBP on forced labor. The committee could consider adding the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act to the bill, but it should include elements to ensure it can be administered and enforced effectively, such as sufficient time to develop an enforcement strategy, input from industry, and clear CBP guidance. I understand the committee is also considering significant changes to anti-dumping and countervailing duty laws to address China's attempts to evade duties and subsidize production in third countries. These are meritorious goals, but the legislation should be honed through a hearing and markup to ensure it is effective and to ensure due process for all of the parties concerned. Likewise, the committee should ensure that any outbound investment screening mechanisms that it considers are carefully crafted to focus on national security and not as tools of economic coercion. The same applies to export controls, a tool whose effectiveness relies on being appropriately targeted on national security and coordination with allies. Third, countering China requires a comprehensive offensive trade agenda with bilateral engagement with China, regional trade agreements, and WTO reform. The Phase 1 deal helped achieve important structural reforms in agriculture, IP, financial services, and it's led to booming agricultural sales. China also appears to be falling short in some areas, but it's been difficult to make a complete assessment due to the limited information available. To help inform next steps, including whether to pursue Phase 2, focus on enforcement, or pursue another strategy entirely, Congress should ask the administration for a full report card and work together on implementation. The United States should also pursue bilateral and regional trade agreements with countries in China's sphere of influence. The United States should join CPTPP and block China's attempts to do so itself. The United States was the driving force behind the agreement, and many of its provisions mirror the bipartisan USMCA. If the United States believes we need to modify provisions, we should renegotiate the deal just like we did with NAFTA. If forced to choose between the United States and China, CPTPP countries would welcome us with open arms. The United States should also pursue a digital trade agreement in the region, complete negotiations with the UK so we can stand together against China, and finish talks with Kenya to prevent China from further encroachment in Africa. Finally, we should seek WTO reforms to ensure its rules cover China's unfair practices and ensure adjudicators don't deprive us of the tools needed to counter them and hold China accountable for breaking WTO rules. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. We'll now turn to questioning. I would like to begin with Ms. Glass. Return to the example of Shein that I mentioned in my introductory comments. In my view, the company's approach is a clear example of the many cross-cutting issues we face with China. The company is abusing or evading U.S. trade laws like de minimis and is in the middle of a Chinese textile industry directly linked to forced labor. All of these undermine American workers and companies. Ms. Glass, in your view, how should Congress work to address these issues?
Chairman Blumenauer, thank you so much for your interest and attention to these issues, particularly Shein, which has gotten a lot of press attention, which is a Chinese e-commerce conglomerate that has basically built a multi-billion-dollar business almost entirely around exploiting the de minimis loophole. And these tariff exemptions made sense in the 1950s when we went on international travel and were bringing packages back. But now with the advent of e-commerce, particularly hypercharged in the COVID-19 environment, we are finding products are coming to our doorstep that have not gone through proper scrutiny by U.S. Customs, have health and safety implications, and are essentially a workaround to our tariff mechanisms and undermining our free trade agreements. I think Congress should do several things, including an exhaustive and immediate review of this problem to develop the critical policies necessary. A few policies that we think should be enacted. Reducing our de minimis level to be in line with international standards. China's de minimis level is $7. The US's de minimis level is $800. We also need to designate e-commerce shippers as the importer of record, barring the utilization of de minimis for certain high-impact, sensitive sectors like ours, where it's been widely documented the use of forced labor. Denying 321 waiver eligibility for these products that also pose a consumer and health safety risk needs to also be addressed, and denying 321 treatment for any products currently subjected to the China 301 tariffs or other trade penalties. In fact, Congress should also look at potentially barring e-commerce shipment from qualifying for de minimis waivers completely. We stand ready to work with the committee, Chairman. This is not just Shein. There are other e-commerce platforms that are taking advantage of this particular loophole, and we need to address it to ensure that we're helping U.S. manufacturers, workers, and those in our regional trade allies.
Thank you very much. At a course of our roundtable yesterday, there were some interesting suggestions about ways to provide a framework and certainty, but still the protection and oversight for this part of the supply chain. And we look forward to working with you as these proposals are developed. Mr. Hausman, I appreciated your story about the detrimental impact that Chinese subsidies and industrial policies can have in the United States. I certainly agree we need to be much more aggressive and assertive on these issues. Along these lines, I know my colleague, Ms. Sewell, has been working diligently on this particular issue. And I understand she's been working with colleagues in the Senate, various stakeholders, and the administration to craft legislation that would strengthen our tools in this front, particularly an outgrowth of the Brown-Portman. Can you talk about the urgency of taking steps to strengthen these tools and any observations you may have?
Yes, I would highlight that, the Brown-Portman bill and now the Sewell-Johnson bill, it provides an opportunity to really contain China's Belt and Road Initiative through trade enforcement pieces. When you look at the idea of, how bad actors like China have used, U.S. trade enforcement law or abused U.S. trade enforcement law, they've looked at new pathways to capturing market share. So, for example, in 2015, USW was able to get tariffs against passenger vehicle tires against China. And then just this last year, we had to file a new trade case against 4 countries because we saw a significant increase in tire capacity in 4 additional countries. And so you're seeing particularly this pivot to third-party countries, and the legislation will help in successive investigations. There's also small pieces like stopping gamesmanship by importers who will make unrepresentative sales. It's really a cheap trick, undermines trade investigations, makes the Commerce Department's work that much harder. And it's one of these opportunities for us to really remedy our trade laws. So those are just a couple of reasons why USW is super supportive of this. I mean, for our members, it's an opportunity to push back and try and make these cases as quick and as effective as possible, because oftentimes you have to show 3 years of injury before you are able to find remedy. And for a worker making, a good salary at a union job, that's lost hours and wages, and that's the last thing we want to do.
Thank you. Dr. Mallory, your testimony highlights an issue that is consistent across many different sectors: the opacity of the Chinese system and the subsequent difficulty in knowing the exact nature and level of Chinese subsidies. I'm very supportive of ongoing negotiations at the WTO to address harmful fisheries subsidy, although, shall we say, progress has been slow. I am hopeful that a high standard outcome can be achieved. Do you have any guidance for how our subcommittee can effectively encourage the enforcement of potential fisheries subsidy agreement with China?
Thanks for the great question. So one of the challenges is that, exactly as you say, what China is doing is, because there's been so much scrutiny of fuel subsidies in the fishing industry across the board, not just China, what China has done is, in order to comply with the letter of the law on this front, what they've done is stopped keeping track of the subsidies at the central level and just kind of kick them down. So they can, in all honesty, say that they don't know what the fuel subsidies are, and they don't technically provide a program for fuel subsidies. It's just costs overall for the fishing industry. So I think what's really important, but these are still being provided at the lower levels. So I think what's really important is to keep in mind that it's sometimes not just the same issues that are at the negotiating table and that have been for a while, like looking at the fuel subsidies, but keep in mind that there are other ways of supporting the industry that might not be apparent at first. You have to, keep your eye on that. So for example, a lot of the subsidies for distant water fishing have shifted away from fuel and towards the construction of these bases around the world. And another part of the subsidies is the indirect subsidies, providing preferential loans, for example, from policy banks. And this isn't really on the radar screen of a lot of the negotiating delegations. So all of that needs to be kept in mind. It's kind of similar to some of the operations that China's carrying out, for example, in the South China Sea with the gray zone, where you're just kind of skirting the line of what's been done previously and taking advantage of loopholes.
Thank you. I appreciate you responding in terms of getting a sense of the complexity and the interrelationship of these techniques. Look forward to continuing our conversation. This is an area of deep interest to me and appreciate your input. Congressman Buchanan.
Well, thank you, Chairman. I can't imagine anything more important than talking about our relationship with China. I think we're all have this idea of free and fair trade. There's nothing about fairness. My sense with China, I go back, was involved with the U.S. Chamber Board IP issues. I went to Beijing 20 years ago. It's even a bigger issue today, just one area. So Mr. Willem, let me ask you, looking at what can we do now? I mean, there are things, I'm just looking at the next year in terms of Trade Promotion Authority, MTB, GSB, things that we could get done, because I'd like to get some things done for our committee and for Congress and for our small businesses and jobs and all that. And then the other thing is I'd like to just throw out to you, and I'll ask Ms. Glass the same thing, is TPP. I had a chance to travel with Chairman Paul Ryan at the time and other members. We went to Asia when this was something that we were engaged in, that conversation before. There was a lot of people for it and then they became against it. But the bottom line, it was pretty obvious. All those countries in and around China didn't trust them, didn't like them, but felt like they had to work with them. So I'd like to have you just, whether my sense is as we got involved with USMCA, TPA is something we should be looking at as well. So what's your thoughts? What can we do near term and make a big difference, or the low hanging fruit? And then as we look down the road a little bit, things like TPP and other things that would be maybe positive and impactful. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, thank you very much for the question. In terms of what we should do in the short term, USICA is something that's staring us in the face right now. And what I would really like to see is a bipartisan process, just like we had in the Senate. The Senate Finance Committee worked together, Republicans and Democrats hand in hand. That's how they got a 91-4 vote for that Trade Act. And I'd like to see the same thing in the Ways and Means Committee, working through that title, figuring out, are there things you want to modify? Are there things you want to add? Are there things you want to take away? And ultimately making that part of a larger package. Because I think the package of USICA has a lot of positive elements. It does have things about running faster, does have defensive elements, and then ultimately I think it can have positive trade elements as well. And I think among the provisions, reinstating a China tariff exception process would be first and foremost in my mind. As I mentioned, I was a part of this. I was a part of the team that put these things in place, but they weren't meant to be permanent. And they were only meant to be in place to leverage China to change behavior. And so we have to ask ourselves, is that working right now? And if it's not, let's figure out a better way to pressure China. And in the interim, you can do something like a tariff exclusion process that is going to allow companies to go to the Biden administration, make their case. Biden administration can look at them using its criteria and say, look, should we grant that exclusion in the interim because it's going to help us with our supply chain goals, it's going to help us fight inflation, it's going to help us grow the economy. So that's what I would do in the short term. And then over the longer term, as you mentioned, we've got to get back in the game in the Indo-Pacific region. I know that TPP has been a difficult political issue for a lot of people. And my view is that if the agreement as originally negotiated doesn't work for you, let's renegotiate it. Let's do exactly what we did to NAFTA, update it and make it more in line with our goals today. And I think we need to have a sense of urgency there. I hear a lot of people say, oh, China's not really serious about joining. It's never going to happen. And I can tell you, I've talked to countries in the region who are taking China's bid very seriously and are looking at that. And for us to let them take advantage of an agreement we negotiated in the first instance and use it to bring them closer to our allies, I think would be a major, major mistake. And so
Well, I know a lot of the countries would love our engagement. Ms. Glass, would you want to add just short-term, long-term, next year compared to looking down the road? What's your thoughts?
Well, thank you so much for the question, Ranking Member Buchanan. I think our industry would say that having just lived through a global pandemic and still struggling through some of this, that 2021 is very different than where we were in 2015. And there are many front burner issues for our industry related to trade right now, particularly as China and nearshoring efforts that demand our immediate attention and focus before rejoining or contemplating rejoining the TPP, and whether or not the TPP is actually good for American workers and manufacturing industries. So I would urge the Congress to focus in on some of these other areas first as a priority. I know Ambassador Tai has indicated putting a pause until we have a further foresight into some of our most pressing issues associated with China.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Buchanan. And I think Mr. Williams raises an interesting point. Some of these tariffs simply didn't leverage behavior, and we ought to be open to things we can do on a bipartisan basis, starting with working through provisions of USICA that I think there can be progress. I look forward to our actually legislating in that regard. May I turn to Mr. Kind?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony here today. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for holding such an important hearing. I mean, the subject matter of this hearing is one that we should have a lot of hearings over, because it deals with one of the key questions, the key challenges that we have in the 21st century, and that's the U.S. relationship with China. And trade is a large component of that. And I agree with Mr. Buchanan's comments earlier that, and I'm all in as far as strengthening what trade remedies and enforcement tools that we have available right now, but it should be done in a thoughtful manner. We should have hearings on it, try to work constructively on a bipartisan basis, reach consensus. That'll be more sustainable in the long run, I think, especially dealing with our relationship with China moving forward. Mr. Williams, let me start with you, because I appreciated your comments and your written testimony. And again, you just raised it here today about what a mistake it was for us to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. And Mr. Buchanan just referenced that himself. I've said in the past, and I'll say today, that I think it's one of the great strategic mistakes we've made as a country in the 21st century. We've excluded ourselves from the fastest growing economic region in the globe, the Pacific Rim area, in a trade agreement with many nations that share our values, that also addresses the structural reforms we're demanding China to make. And that's what I don't get in our withdrawal from the TPP, because in it there are enhanced intellectual property protections, prohibition against forced tech transfers, prohibition against forced joint ventures, the subsidization of state-sponsored industries, the overcapacity and the dumping issues that China is fond of practicing, all with strong enforcement mechanisms in it. And I guess we're at a seminal moment for our country to make a decision of just which way we're going to go here, whether we resort to more self-help, more unilateral action, which will only, I fear, invite like-kind action from other countries, tit-for-tat trade wars, or whether we try to work in a constructive fashion in a rules-based global trading system, one that we tried to help shape and lead and form since the Second World War. And the TPP, the new CPTPP, fits within that dynamic. So how crucial do you think it is for us to find a path forward in that again? What recommendations would you make, knowing that there are certain provisions that will have to be adjusted and changed for it to be acceptable in a bipartisan fashion here at home? And what type of timeline do you envision with all this?
Well, thank you, Congressman Kind, for your questions. As a fellow Wisconsinite, I think we're very like-minded. Maybe it shouldn't be surprising. Look, I think it's critical, and I think time is of the essence. Kurt Campbell, one of the deputy national security advisors, just said the other day that China's attempts to join CPTPP are deadly serious, and that other countries are looking at this in a real way. And so I think we need to show them very quickly that we have an alternative and that they can work with us instead of with China. In terms of how you do that, I think this committee should start engaging with USTR and talking through, what are the things that you actually may find problematic and want to change, that you want to update, and then start to socialize that idea with some of the other countries. My sense is that they will want to work with us, but we haven't had those conversations, and we need to do it.
That's my sense too. In conversations with other countries, they're wondering where we are and why we've excluded ourselves since we were the lead of the negotiations. And the irony is, much of USMCA, which received wide bipartisan support in modernizing NAFTA and bringing that into the 21st century, a lot of that was cut and paste from TPP. So it wouldn't be a stretch for us now to apply those same values and principles to our admission into TPP. And I think it's important that we do so to show that we are in fact back and we're back in the game again. But with our exclusion from it, I think it's detrimental. We tried the 232 and 301 route with China with not much leverage, not much to show for it, other than some tit for tat response from them. But it's not just China with TPP. It's the EU now, it's UK, it's other countries looking to join. One point of disagreement with you, however, I think eventually, don't we want China to join TPP with the prohibitions that would be in place and the structural reforms that we're demanding of China with the enforceability provisions? I mean, isn't that ultimately what we're trying to accomplish to the WTO today with China?
Well, I think over a long enough time horizon, you may be correct. I think in the short term, their participation would water it down and it would inhibit our ability to really link supply chains with allies. But I think over time, you would want to do that. And maybe you can better do that through a multilateral organization like the WTO.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, thank you, Ron. That's, you're, as always, very thoughtful and looking at the big picture. And I think you're correct that we need to spend more time and a thoughtful approach working through these issues. I think there is a lot of common ground and there's some experience that we can take advantage of. And I look forward to working with you and the subcommittee to focus on these relationships and make some incremental progress as we go along. Mr. Nunes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. Thanks for holding this webinar. And my question's for you, Mr. Willems. The last administration worked very hard to change the trade relationship with China, including putting on tariffs and numerous other matters. And in your testimony, I thought it was very thoughtful, the need for USTR to deliver a report to Congress on China's progress. And so my question is kind of twofold, but can you kind of expand on that thought on what USTR should look at and how they should base it, what they should base it on? And then also what your assessment is of China living up to their phase one obligations. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for the question. I may take them backwards if you don't mind. In terms of their general track record, and this is based on the limited information we have from public sources, from companies who do business in China. Generally speaking, I would say it appears that they are implementing most of the structural commitments. And in my opinion, the structural commitments were the most important in the deal because those really got China to change systemic laws and regulations rather than simply purchasing more products over a 2-year horizon. So I think the structural is more important. It seems like they're doing most of the IP. USTR and its national trade estimate criticized some of the things on counterfeit, which is some of the, an area where they obviously can improve. I've heard at agriculture, I think USTR said they've done 50 of the 57. They said that in a public document, 50 of the 57 structural components. The one area where companies have complained is on biotechnology. On financial services, they were supposed to open up those sectors where you wouldn't require majority Chinese ownership anymore. And I've heard some companies starting to get licenses to operate in that market. So there are some successes, but it's mixed. We don't really know for sure. On the purchasing, it does appear agriculture is doing incredibly well. I'm sure you have heard from constituents who have sales going into China at levels that they've never done before. But in the other areas, they seem really, really short. But that's sort of my perception from being in and around this space. but what you really need is a report card. And, I've heard from many members on the Hill that they don't have any visibility into this. And so, look, I don't want to prescribe that there's one way to do this, but I think USTR does owe you all a briefing. It can be confidential. It could be part of the report on China's WTO compliance that they do on an annual basis. There's lots of different ways to do it, but they need to give you that visibility so that you can work with them and figure out, what do we do next? Do we, pursue phase 2 because they've done a good job on phase 1 and maybe that signals something about phase 2? Or do we double down on enforcement and do we look at ways to get more leverage over them? So again, the clarity is important. I don't want to say there's one specific way you have to do it, but I think it just needs to be done more than it has been to date.
Thank you, Mr. Willems. That's, I think, very thoughtful approach, and I think we should explore it. With that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nunes. Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I certainly want to thank all of the witnesses for some very enlightening testimony and a great discussion. It's pretty clear that we have a very serious economic relationship with China, given the fact that they are our largest merchandise trading partner, our third largest export market, and our biggest source of input of imports. But yet we have some very serious concerns with China, and many of those that have great impact on our economy. Especially are we concerned about labor and human rights violations, state-sponsored owned industries, theft of intellectual property rights, technology transfer, currency manipulation, purchase commitment, dumping of goods, and environmental responsibility. All of these are issues that affect and could affect a fair and balanced approach to trade with China. When I'm talking to business persons and just on the streets, they mention a lot of things they think we could do. Some say stop letting China invest in the United States. Some say put sanctions on companies that have stolen U.S. intellectual property rights and technology. Form a coalition with Europe and Japan to push back. Do not allow products to enter the United States from companies who practice forced labor and have human rights violations. And of course, buy American in terms of what we do ourselves. Let me ask each one of you, we hear a lot of things. Those that you would consider to be most practical and most possible, most likely, and anything that you hear that you would just consider to be outright not practical, not really likely to happen. So what if I just started with you, Ms. Glass, then Dr. Hausman, Dr. Mallory, Mr. Williams?
Congressman, thank you for the very thoughtful and challenging question. On the practical side, the impractical is we're never going to be able to limit China's capacity in the global marketplace, meaning they are going to continue being a pervasive player. So as many guardrails as we can put up are incredibly important, but it's just with that profound understanding that they are going to be a strong entity for many years to come and are bolstering some of their industries in ways that we've never seen before. And in fact, Congressman, just to note something on subsidies, over the last 10 years, unit prices for textile and apparel products have been on a steep decline from China, and over the last year have decreased 25%, yet consumer prices for these products have increased 4%. So who's making the money? and how is this being subsidized? But in terms of things that are in our trajectory that we can get done very, very quickly, beyond the MTB passage to help some U.S. manufacturers compete in the global marketplace, closing the de minimis loophole, effectively banning the cotton and cotton products coming from China, from Xinjiang. I do not believe we've given CBP the resources to effectively administer the withhold release order. We should be holding daily press conferences on the stopment of shipments coming in, because that will help recalibrate supply chains, both here to the US and to our Western Hemisphere partners. The other thing I want to note, Congressman, and maybe a little bit outside the committee's jurisdiction, but the Chinese give their companies interest-free loans to invest in places like Central America. We need to be competitive in the kinds of loans and tax structures here in the United States and in our regional partners to help more US companies invest as they're recalibrating supply chains out of Asia. These are some proactive things that we can do in the very short term, and I'll cede back my time for this very, very thoughtful question.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Hausman.
Yes, briefly, since I think there's not a lot of time here, I think on a practical standpoint, I think that
Actually, the time has expired.
Okay.
If you could just briefly make a comment, I would appreciate it.
Sure. I would say one key component for us is that no matter how our investment strategy and trade strategy is how we incorporate our labor rights into this scenario. The USMCA has a rapid response mechanism, which is new and is still developing. But we also have to look at these practices by Chinese-based firms using forced labor practices. For example, in Serbia, there's allegations of Vietnamese laborers being having their passports taken as they work to construct a tire plant. I think those are sorts of things that we need to look at both from the GSP side and from our trade side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Rice.
Mr. Chairman, and I'm so happy that we're having this hearing today to discuss global trade issues, and particularly the issues with China. I think that the Trump administration set upon a very aggressive path to try to deal with a bully in the international trade area. And unfortunately, I don't think the Biden administration has proceeded with that aggressive path. And I think that's really the only way we can deal with these folks. I want to say to Mrs. Glass, I really appreciate her being here today. Textiles obviously employ tens of thousands of South Carolinians, and actually in my district with fiber industries and Highland Industries, among others. So I understand and appreciate the concerns of the textile industry with respect to the Chinese willingness to be an international bully and to exploit every loophole to try to avoid the law. I also want to say thank you to Mrs. Mallory. Obviously, living on the coast of South Carolina, the seafood industry is very important to us as well. And to Mr. Hausman, I have at least 2 steel mills in my district between Nucor and Liberty in Georgetown. So I understand how the steel industry is affected by unfair trade and theft of intellectual property and all the things that we talk about China ad nauseum and never seem to find any real solution to. I wanted to speak for just a moment to Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, I agree with your assessment that these tariffs were put in place only as a temporary measure to force China to the table. And unfortunately, we were sidelined for COVID, and then we've had a change in the administration. I'm really not sure what the Biden administration's trade policy is with respect to China or anybody else. The hold on aggressive negotiation with China makes 0 sense to me. And I think we've gone so far to pull China to the table. We achieved the phase 1 agreement. The phase one agreement was never intended to be the end. We were going to move on to multiple phases. And I think in the end, the prior trade representative, prior administration made it clear that what they wanted was a unilaterally enforceable trade agreement with China, because the World Trade Organization itself is really not an effective arbiter of disputes, because it takes so long and it's really not practical. So in the end, sir, I was curious about where you saw what our objectives were in the ultimate deal with China that we got sidelined with, and now we've had a change in administration.
Thank you, Congressman. In terms of the objectives that we set out to achieve, I mean, the first one, and the one that was governed by the statute, by Section 301, was that we wanted China to change some of its most unfair practices. And we were trying to negotiate disciplines that would require them to change those practices. And first and foremost among them was forced technology transfer. And, we made some incremental progress in the phase one deal. They eliminated some policies related to forced technology transfer, but it really wasn't a more limited area than we would have liked. We had tried to do it much more broadly.
But that was just phase one.
Right.
We were going to move on to phase two and maybe even phase three, right?
Right. And I think that we should revisit whether that is appropriate. And I do think we need to continue to engage with China, because even if we're making incremental progress, that's better than letting them get away with what they've been doing for years. And ultimately that, if we also have more market access, that helps our companies, that helps our economy. So I do think we should think about, we need, as I mentioned in my testimony, we need more information from USTR about how phase one is going. And then based on that information, I think it can help you all direct them. Where should we go in a phase two? What else should we be looking at? But there were things that were left on the table in the negotiations. There was a much broader services chapter that ultimately.
Well, it seems to me, I've been on this trade subcommittee for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. And every meeting we have about China, we talk about the same issues. And I think there's so many loopholes that everybody on the panel has repeatedly talked about. And if we close those loopholes through USICA or the next bill that comes down, China's going to exploit another loophole. It seems to me that we've got to have a real reset with the unilateral ability to enforce it, to enforce our objectives if we're ever going to resolve these issues with this international bully. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. I'm looking forward to exploring some of the things you mentioned, areas of textile and fisheries. I think there are some common interests. I certainly agree that it's important for us to move forward with specific deliverables that enable us to achieve objectives that we've been talking about. The only area I take exception is the notion somehow that the Biden administration is incoherent and the Trump administration was focused and effective. I think they confused our friends and allies, imposed huge costs on American business and consumers with very little tangible results to show for it. And I think we have an opportunity with our subcommittee to take areas that we agree on and make some progress. And I look forward to working with you in that regard.
I think if we pursue China in an incremental fashion, there will always be the next increment. And the only way to do it is to have a wholesale change that we can unilaterally enforce. And I worry, and we need to have a hearing about the financial relationship of the Biden family and China. I worry about that. I think that's a real concern.
Sure you do. Thank you, Mr. Rice. Ms. Dobeni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here, in particular Dr. Mallory from my alma mater, the University of Washington, for joining us so early from our Washington. First, I wanted to talk about the significance of the digital economy and the challenges posed by China's restrictive digital policies. In our state of Washington, it's home to a vibrant technology industry, and digital trade is especially important to the state's more than 5,000 technology companies and $2.8 billion of digital exports. Nationally, U.S. exports of digital services are worth over $500 billion. And the Chinese Communist Party is currently advancing its own model for digital governance that favors censorship, surveillance, and control over civil rights, privacy, the free flow of data, and an open internet. For example, China's new so-called privacy law requires even more data localizations, steep fines, and ambiguous requirements for American companies. And this law has led to companies like US companies to pull services from the Chinese market, yet it exempts the Chinese government, so it'll continue to have access to its citizens' personal data. I'm concerned not only that enacting these policies internally in China, but that it's exporting this model to countries around the world. So if the US doesn't reassert global leadership in this area, our economy and our global influence will be put at a significant disadvantage. One action Congress can take is to pass our own federal consumer data privacy law that gives Americans control over their data and helps us bring policy to the international table. That's why I authored the Information Transparency and Personal Data Control Act, so that we have a strong national privacy standard. That would be an important place for us to start. I also just wanted to express concern that Dr. Mallory raised over Chinese government's tariffs on seafood, harmful fisheries subsidies, and distant water fishing fleet. Dr. Mallory is an expert on these issues. You know better than most about how the seafood industry is so critical to Washington State's economy, our tribal communities, and our culture. And sustainable fisheries support 60% of Washington's maritime economy. That's 146,000 jobs and $30 billion in economic activity, and China is a major export market. So Dr. Mallory, I wondered if you could speak to the importance of the seafood trade between Washington State and China, how it impacts fisheries management, indigenous populations, businesses, consumers, and workers. And thank you again for being with us.
Thanks for the great question. So the state of Washington, what kind of shows how important that relationship is between the state of Washington and China is the fact that the only other city that all the senior Chinese leaders have visited since Deng Xiaoping, besides Washington, D.C., has been Seattle because of the importance of trade. And, certainly the last few years have negatively impacted that trade. And I think it's important, and this kind of gets back a little bit to Congressman Davis's question earlier too, like, what practical solutions can we really pursue? And I think first of all, we need to take a longer term view on our relationship with China. I think it's really important to differentiate between the average Chinese citizen, many of whom in China are very upset about the direction that their governing system has taken. There's a difference between those people and the current administration in China. So I think it's still important to think of ways in which we can engage with China that are, less threatening to the U.S. economy and security. To get back to the Representative Davis' question too, I think getting ourselves right first is really important because we are not going to be able to change China. And so working on our own infrastructure, our own economy, becoming a vibrant, maybe more manufacturing of U.S. goods, so that we can be a country that other countries want to actually purchase our goods from. I don't think we want to be in the position of insisting that another country buy our goods. I think just the power of our own production, I think, should be attractive enough. And so I think for Washington State, we are a great model for this. We have a great maritime economy, vibrant fisheries, a tech sector that is really innovative. We've done a lot on blue economy, the Sustainable Port Initiative. So all of that, I think if we're thinking about ourselves and how to get, the balance of, economy, trade, and fisheries protection right in the Pacific Northwest, even more broadly, I think that, can be a great model moving forward. And, also speaking of the CPTPP, I think that's an important component of this too, because the CPTPP has much stricter environmental regulations incorporated into it than China's RCEP does. And so, at least on environmental fronts, I think it's a really important agreement. And it provides, were the US to rejoin that, I think it provides alternatives to other countries besides just China. And it also gives us more opportunities besides China to export the goods that we produce on the American markets.
Thank you. My time's expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. LaHood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony here today. And Mr. Chairman, thanks for having this hearing today. I do think it is timely, as we've heard from the conversation already. Lots of opinions on China. And frankly, it's been a little frustrating with the current administration that we haven't seen a substantive trade agenda as it relates to China and the Indo-Pacific region. We've had multiple reviews that have gone on by this administration. There's been a review by USTR, by DOD, by the National Security Council as it relates to China, but yet we've still not seen a roadmap or a vision when it comes to trade. And there are obviously many issues at stake here. And so that's been frustrating, particularly as we look at the U.S., how the U.S. can show leadership and support in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think it's imperative now more than ever to counter China in the region. So I think collectively, many of us share that frustration. I will also say, Mr. Chairman, as the co-chair of the U.S.-China Working Group and then also serving on the China Task Force, there's no shortage of topics to address within the trade relationship, including, as we've heard already, phase one obligations, how the administration looks at phase two, the 301 exclusion process, and how the U.S. should approach challenges in the trade and investment environment in China. Obviously, this hearing is timely today. I would mention that yesterday, Congresswoman Carol Miller and she also serves on the subcommittee, introduced legislation titled the U.S. Trade Leadership in the Indo-Pacific and China Act that focuses on the need for a proactive and strategic U.S. trade presence to counter China. Our bill works to develop a plan to address the ongoing trade challenges with China in a proactive way, incentivizing and compelling USTR to work in an expedited, transparent, and clear manner when laying out a long-term trade strategy that serves U.S. economic and national security interests. We are proud of this legislation and appreciate both Mr. Brady and Mr. Buchanan's support on these issues. Having said that, I would like to switch to we've heard a little bit already today on the 301 process, and I think we all agree there are concerns on how narrow and limited the recently announced exclusions process is from USTR. So please, I may ask you a question related to that. Do you agree that we need a more robust and transparent exclusions process? And can you offer any thoughts on the impact to U.S. interests if we continue to limit the process?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you very much for your leadership on these issues. I do want to say I had a chance to look at the legislation that you put together with Congresswoman Miller. I think it's fantastic and worthy of this committee's consideration. With respect to 301, I do support a more robust process. I think that what the Biden administration has put forward so far is very, very limited. And it really just doesn't offer our companies the ability to go to the administration and make the case that they are getting harmed in certain circumstances because of the tariffs that are in place. And I think the Biden administration could take a look at this with its own criteria, criteria that looks at whether the products in question are central to Made in China 2025, whether they're available elsewhere, whether they're contributing to their broader supply chain goals, and ultimately make a decision. And again, I think you will know better than anyone. I mean, I'm sure you're hearing from companies in your district. I know a lot of other members are hearing from companies in their district that right now these tariffs are harmful. Let me say some of these tariffs are harmful, right? I mean, I think we don't want to paint this all with a broad brush. The goal here isn't to say let's get rid of all of our leverage on China, but the goal is to say let's be more targeted. And the ones that are hurting us let's give our companies a chance to petition for their removal while keeping in place some of the leverage that's needed on products that aren't hurting us. And that's what I think a broader tariff exclusion process could do.
Thanks for that, Clete. Maybe just as a follow-up on the legislation we've introduced, Congresswoman Miller and myself. In there, we talk about reporting requirements from USTR, and it's been referenced about the need for more information from USTR as it relates to China. And we lay out 6 different provisions in there requiring them to report to Congress on a number of these items. Can you comment on that at all, Clayton, and how impactful that could be?
I think it's critical to allow you to be able to help work with the administration to come up with a strategy moving forward.
Darren, your time has expired, and starting
Thank you.
another question, I think, is not fair to the rest of the speakers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Nope. I'd like to turn to Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by acknowledging Ms. Kimberly Glass of Lockport, New York. It's always encouraging to have a fellow Western New Yorker among us. Kimberly was a 10-year veteran of Capitol Hill and worked for my predecessor, John LaFalce, and continues to work on behalf of American workers, businesses, keeping jobs here in the United States where they belong. So thank you, Kimberly. I think that the United States has to be tougher on China, but I think more importantly, the United States has to be tougher we have to be tougher on ourselves about China. It's no longer a competition about toys and t-shirts and tennis shoes. It's about China's ambition to become a global technological superpower sometime this century as part of the Made in China 2025 and Belt and Road Initiative. Clearly, China is investing in the growth and diversity of its economy to compete on a global scale. We need to do the same. So to do that, China seeks to lead the world in production of artificial intelligence, green energy, aerospace, engineering, manufacturing, 5G, and robotics. The list goes on. They're aggressively expanding overseas in infrastructure to move their goods and services to foreign markets. All the while, they take U.S. intellectual property, deny American firms access to their markets, and subsidize their favored industries to create gluts of global oversupply that harm American businesses and workers. I proudly represent 1,300 employees and steel workers at the Sumitomo tire plant located in Tonawanda, New York. That facility has been in continuous operation since 1920. On 2 occasions, I've testified before the U.S. International Trade Commission to protect their jobs, mostly from tires unfairly dumped and subsidized by the Chinese government. I believe that the United States has an obligation to protect our nation's manufacturers and workers from unfair trade practices. We must be proactive against the Chinese government's abuses of trade law and human rights. So, Mr. Hausman, can you expand on the threat posed to American manufacturing by Chinese plants being built in other countries and how they take advantage of existing law and enforcement loopholes to undercut American businesses and workers?
Yes, sure. I think this is the key piece here is that, our union is using our trade enforcement laws and spending significant resources to defend, workers like those that are in your in Sumitomo plant. And this is, and as we continue to do this expansion of tariff regime on these tires, we've had to do it because, in part, we've seen this growth and dramatic expansion of tire capacity by multinationals and Chinese-based companies into third-party countries that are then exporting into the domestic market at below market rates and subsidized. And so, our concern, and mentioned earlier in the testimony here, is this idea that, China is now expanding into the GSP beneficiary countries with significant subsidization and providing resources to build plants that will be an export model into the U.S. market. And so really it is a question is, should our general systems preference program, or should we provide tariff cuts to third-party countries that are providing significant resources to Chinese firms to build into their facility? Like Serbia provided tax abatements and provided resized their they reformatted their industrial land policy to help build the plant, and now are turning a blind eye to forced labor conditions by by Chinese workers on Vietnamese transplants. And so I think, this is an opportunity to really reassess how we approach things. And this is why we have to be very diligent in our trade policy and support, additional AD/CVD enforcement laws, but also look at how our development policy works so that it works for all working people and ensures that U.S. workers are the primary beneficiary of any trade enforcement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your leadership, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Estes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses as well for being with us today. Today's hearing is incredibly important. Democrats and Republicans alike understand that when it comes to China, we need bold and decisive policies that can combat the dangerous and unfair trade practices of the Chinese Communist Party. Under the previous administration, the United States started addressing some of the long-standing issues in the area of global trade. And now we must hold China accountable for the phase one commitments and end the trade moratoriums that's holding our country back. China certainly hasn't stopped pursuing world dominance in the global markets. Their Belt and Road Initiative, Made in China 2025 agenda, and continued massive subsidies provide rightful concern to the United States and our allies, not to mention a litany of other troubling actions like their forced labor practices, intellectual property theft, and menacing military flights in airspace near Taiwan. Simply put, the United States cannot take a back seat to the Chinese Communist Party, which is why it's important that we remove trade barriers to trade negotiations, reinforce the phase one commitments, and re-engage with China on phase two, utilizing our existing leverage. I've said this many times, and my colleagues on this side of the aisle have called for trade tools like TPA so that we can continue to build upon the good trade work from the previous administration. And as a representative from an agriculture community, I know that enforcing phase one purchasing agreements would provide significant benefits to the United States. All of us here know that while China has exhibited compliance in some areas of the agreement, they've fallen short in ag, manufacturing, and energy purchases. Phase one was a significant first step, but we need to follow through and a sequel that continues to advance the interests of American workers and businesses. Without that action, I fear that China's practices will further exacerbate the discriminatory treatment, market distortions, and widespread IP theft. Mr. Willems, the United States must have a leadership role in writing trade rules for the 21st century. We've made great first step through our work with USMCA, and I'm hopeful we can build upon this bipartisan momentum to negotiate new trade agreements with willing partners such as the UK and Kenya and within the Indo-Pacific area. However, I'm concerned that the administration does not have the tools it requires because of the expiration of the Trade Promotion Authority. Could you speak a little bit about the importance of the TPA in countering China's growing influence abroad?
Thank you, Congressman. I'm very happy to do so. And I agree with, I think, your general premise, which is that we really need to show leadership in getting into trade agreements around the world. And I will, to take a step back, I will say, look, I think that in many respects, we can be complimentary of this administration where they have continued the tough on China policy and they have continued a lot of Trump administration policies that people feared they would roll back, some of the investment restrictions and things like that. But the big hole in their strategy that needs to be filled is this void with offensive trade agreements. And TPA is the tool that we use. It's the oversight tool that you have to encourage them to do so and to work with them on what the negotiating objectives should be, and then to ensure that it can get passed through Congress. And so I think TPA is essential. And I would say, we've talked a lot about CPTPP and Indo-Pacific agreements, which is clearly part of this equation. But the two others that you mentioned, the UK and Kenya, I think are also important. And I think they are agreements that really should be bipartisan. And if you look at the UK, this is a country who for many years had actually been resistant to getting tough on China. They've been changing in recent years, and I think getting an agreement where we link our supply chains with them, we create, common standards, can help encourage them to stand up to China in an even more robust fashion. And then Kenya, this is a country China's targeted with Belt and Road funding. It's a country where they have put a lot of resources in trying to build their relationship, and we need to be in the game and again give them an alternative. And really, it would be historic on the African continent to be the first FTA that we do there. And I think our trade policy has not been focused enough on Africa, especially when China's trying to expand its influence there. So I like all the ideas that you have.
Great. I just wish we had more time to talk about. I mean, there's so many important issues here with intellectual property theft and labor rights and forced labor issues that are out there. I just wish we had more time to talk about how do we solve these issues. But I will give back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you for those 5 seconds, Ron. And I agree that these are areas that we do want to take more of the subcommittee's time to explore, and look forward to doing that with you. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thanks to the witnesses for a really thoughtful set of observations. And I do think just the tone, even though we know we have some differences in terms of approach, the tone of this hearing, I think, sets a good stage for us to be able to work in a bipartisan fashion, because our goals are obviously the same. We want to protect American jobs, protect the American economy, take on the abuses in China, particularly the human rights abuses. So thank you. I represent Hemlock Semiconductor, which is a company that makes polysilicon, a base component in solar panels. Hemlock was a main supplier at one point in time to China of polysilicon, but after the U.S. took trade remedy action due to China's unfair dumping of solar panels, China blocked American polysilicon in their market. With China already having cornered much of the solar supply chain, this action basically crushed the U.S. solar manufacturing industry. Today, China controls 90% of the world's solar supply chain, while American workers have suffered job losses and closed factories, including workers that I represent. I've worked with members of this subcommittee and some outside stakeholders to investigate China's solar industry, specifically polysilicon production, and we've uncovered, not surprisingly, that China is making polysilicon in Xinjiang using forced Uyghur labor. Uyghurs have been subjected to forced sterilization, other horrific human rights abuses. And the Biden administration considers their treatment genocide, as do I. That's why I applauded the administration for recently executing a withhold release order for products made with polysilicon from Xinjiang, blocking a large quantity of those products from the U.S. market. The message was clear that those in the solar industry, you must move your supply chain out of Xinjiang and China. As a result, we have seen a surge of demand for U.S. polysilicon, creating jobs here in the U.S. at companies like the one I represent, Hemlock Semiconductor. Right now, we're debating legislation before Congress, as we've been discussing, as to how best increase America's competitiveness against China and level the playing field for workers. So if I could turn to Roy, or I guess I should call you Mr. Hausman in this more formal setting. To support U.S. workers, we've worked on tax incentives for solar production, including Buy America provisions for solar tax credits, and blocking products from China, but it doesn't seem yet to be enough. Steel workers, as you know, have had a lot of experience trying to address these unfair trade practices in places like China. So I guess I just give you another opportunity to tell us how you think we can best address the specific issues of forced labor in Xinjiang through legislation in Congress. Mr. House.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Representative Kildee. And I do think, highlighting the withhold release order is a great start, right? And the ways to bolster this and to actually look at how China is using forced labor tactics to expand capacity and control market share. It's something that we have to continuously engage in. So Representative McGovern's legislation on the Uyghurs is an example of an opportunity to expand and hold companies and the country accountable. Because quite frankly, we need to make sure that those that are choosing to make investments in the People's Republic of China are being fully transparent with their supply chain and recognition that these tactics exist. And then combined, as you've pointed out, with good domestic policy to encourage domestic investment and the growth of a domestic solar supply chain. And then, really, it's this idea of also addressing the issues of, not only just forced labor and growth and expansion of a domestic industry, but an opportunity to, ensure that they're good jobs and that they're good union jobs. I think about this, we look at, there's been a lot of discussion about TPP. And when we look back, the original TPP agreement had, up to 60% of a product of a car could come from China before being fully assembled. And one of the major reasons why we were opposed to it. So we really do need to review our trade agreements and how our trade laws work so that we can better contain China's forced labor tactics and ensure our trade agreements work for working people here in the U.S.
Thank you very, very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Kildee. Dr. Ferguson. Do we have you? Ms. Miller?
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer and Ranking Member Buchanan. And thank you to all of y'all for being here today. I'm so excited about this subject, of course. And I firmly believe how important fair trade practices are, particularly, I have steel in my district as well. But I'd like to talk to you about the fact that my colleague, Congressman LaHood, and I yesterday introduced the U.S. trade leadership in the Indo-Pacific and China Act. I believe it's very pertinent and very timely legislation. The Biden administration spent the first 10 months of their time in office sorting through a top-down plan on China. We are now nearly a year in, and with little to no action or even a plan on how to engage with China. We are at such a critical juncture that we cannot waste time. We need leadership. So our legislation would create a blueprint for both Congress and the administration to assert trade leadership in the Indo-Pacific region and with China. The bill would urge Congress to pass trade promotion authority and urge the administration to consider the possibility of negotiating new trade agreements or joining and improving our existing trade agreements in the Indo-Pacific, such as the CPTPP. The bill also instructs the administration to bring Congress into the fold regarding their discussions in this critical region. The second portion of our bill instructs the administration to outline a clear long-term economic strategy for our trading relationship with China, particularly as portions of the phase one comes to a close. I think this legislation has aspects that both my Democrat and Republican colleagues can agree upon. And as we chart forward our path, we've got to do it thoughtfully. Mr. Willems, thank you for your testimony. I think you bring up so many important points on how to grow our economy and the ways to best engage with the Chinese. As you know, the Chinese have expressed interest in joining the CPTPP. While they may not be able to meet the standards of this agreement, their eagerness to join should draw international attention. How do you think the United States can reassert leadership in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman, for a great question and for a great piece of legislation. And I will say right off the bat that I think doing some of the things articulated in your bill are exactly how we could assert leadership. And that is getting into the region, having a proactive offensive trade agenda where we try to work with allies and partners and create common sets of rules that can be used to counter China, where we can link together our supply chains and where we can create more market opportunities for our workers and businesses, I think is great. And again, I mentioned this earlier, and I do want to underscore it. I think that there is this perception that China cannot meet TPP's obligations, and therefore we shouldn't worry about it. And I would say, I think that would be a mistake. And we have to recognize that, China's at the table. They're negotiating with these other countries. They're trying to get in. And in the process of doing that, they're going to make commitments. They're going to say things, and we just can't take that risk. And so, again, I'll go back to what Kurt Campbell, our Deputy National Security Advisor, said. He said it is deadly serious what China is trying to do. And so we need to get back in a seat at the table and basically negotiate it in a way that works for us, and be a party to it so we can block them. And I know Mr. Hausman, was talking earlier about the autos provisions. And there may be legitimate concerns about those provisions. I know that they are quite different than USMCA, but if that's the way we feel, we have a lot of options. We can look at renegotiating. We can look at, as I mentioned in my testimony, we could say, look, we're going to join the agreement, but we're not going to join everything. Maybe those are ones that we keep to the side. Maybe we add new provisions. I think forced labor is an area that a lot of folks in this committee would like to see added. And so I think there's lots of different ways we can do this. But the bottom line is it just doesn't make sense for us to sit on the sidelines while China's at the table and not put forward a vision. And so I think your legislation puts forward a great vision we should take a look at.
Well, thank you. So we want to get them to the table. Do you have any great ideas how we can do that? And are we really going to go into a phase 2?
Chairman Blumenauer is about to gavel me. So I would be happy to talk about that in a further intervention.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Panetta.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can hear me as I'm doing this remotely with my phone as I'm balancing another hearing. So thank you very much for having this hearing, and I'm honored to participate. And thanks to all the witnesses for your time and your information on a very, very important topic that, as you can tell by some of the questions from my colleagues, we're very interested in on the Ways and Means Subcommittee here that dealing with trade. So thank you very much. Now, obviously, many of you understand how we use trade policy to help and raise standards all over the world and to help countries develop. Strong enforceable laws, trade laws especially, are critical for fair international trade. Now, nowhere is this more critical that we're seeing than in China, with whom we have an outsized trade relationship and which has unique challenges clearly. However, while some countries, especially smaller nations, struggle to meet the higher environmental and labor standards that we like to have, China often chooses to ignore these standards as a matter of gaining competitive advantage for more, I'd say, malevolent means. IP theft, as you know, and forced technology transfer have long been issues faced by American countries which impact American workers. But it's the forced labor aspect of it which is either ignored or outright supported by Beijing, and that's an issue that we have to deal with, whether it's affecting the Uyghur population in Xinjiang or migrant workers on distant water fishing vessels. There are issues that contribute to these unfair trade practices and hurt workers. And so clearly, when it comes to tolerated or supported forced labor, we must act. We got a moral obligation to act. Now, on one of those parts that I mentioned, I want to focus on IUU fishing. I'm sure, Dr. Mallory, I want to focus on you. And obviously, you understand, and you probably saw the 2021 National Marine Fisheries Services report to Congress, which highlighted several ways in which Chinese fishing fleets were in violation of international conservation measures and downright guilty of illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, IUU fishing. Now, the report notes that over 30 Chinese vessels, there were 30 Chinese vessels of the National Pacific Marine Fisheries Convention on that list, on the IUU vessel list, that were suspected of engaging in this type of illegal fishing. Dr. Mallory, do you know that how IUU fishing is correlated? Just give us a brief explanation as to how it's correlated with forced labor. And why is that? And what are the circumstances most conducive for forced labor on these ships that conduct this IUU fishing?
Great, thank you for the question. So what's been happening, and this is not just China, but China is definitely putting a lot of effort to increase their activity doing this. Fishing vessels want to stay at sea for as long as possible because then they can operate and catch a lot of fish. And so what China is doing is building a lot more transshipment vessels or reefers to pick up catch from the fishing vessels and then transport it back to ports. And so what that does is enables the fishing vessels to stay at sea for up to 2 years in some cases. And so you've got crew members. There's recently a news story on this from a reporter at the AP who talked to he went out with Sea Shepherd and talked to one of the crew members who this is recently, and the crew member didn't know that the COVID pandemic was happening. That's how long these people have been at sea. So, and a lot of the people who are recruited to work on these ships are from either inland provinces in China, so they're just not familiar with this kind of work, or from other developing countries. And I also want to point out too that it's not just the forced labor on the ships that's a problem, but because the Chinese fishing vessels are fishing in the high seas off the coast of developing countries in South America, off the coast of Africa, and in some cases also on the basis of bilateral fisheries agreements in their coastal waters, that is also negatively impacting those populations. A lot of the fish that China would have purchased from those countries is now just being caught by China directly themselves. There are things like unfair joint ventures that are being signed where Chinese are operating them, but it's technically still a local company, so they take advantage of the benefits that the local company would get. And so this is also decreasing the food supply for a lot of these countries too, some subsistence level. So it's not just the crew members, but also the impact on the coastal populations that would otherwise be using those resources.
Great. Thank you for that answer. I got 6 seconds left, but I also would want to mention something that we should take a look at. The U.S. Seafood Import Monitoring Program, the SIMP program, to prevent these. And when I have time later on, we'll ask about that. I yield back. Thank you, Dr. Mallory.
Thank you, Mr. Panetta. Ms. Murphy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. As we've heard already in this hearing, everybody can acknowledge that China engages in pervasive and really profound unfair trade practices. And I don't think anybody, maybe except for the Chinese themselves, even attempts to argue about that. But I think the question before us is a really hard one, and that's, what policy steps does the United States actually take that would maximize the likelihood that the CCP would improve its behavior, and while also minimizing the economic damage caused to U.S. companies, U.S. consumers, and the U.S. economy, especially in this moment when everyone is facing so many challenges from the pandemic and also from inflation. I've made my views on this issue pretty clear to the point of maybe redundancy, but if the goal is to maximize our leverage over China and to minimize self-inflicted pain, then I have to say that the U.S. trade policy to date has been a failure. Some of the things are particular lowlights, and we've talked a little bit about this in this hearing, which was President Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the TPP. While it was a disappointing decision and a strategic mistake of the highest order, I was even more disappointed to see that it was greeted with almost silence from most Democrats and Republicans in Congress. And then, the president imposed the Section 232 tariffs on aluminum and steel imports from adversaries and allies alike, basically leading to damaging counter tariffs on a range of our exports. And I think these 232 tariffs, they're of questionable legality. They've really ticked off and alienated partners in Europe and Asia. And they've really complicated our efforts to create a united front against China's abusive conduct in trade and other areas. While I'm glad to see the US and the EU are now taking some steps, however belated and however incomplete, to diffuse this tariff war, I think more has to be done there. And then finally, another low light, the Section 301 tariffs on a lot of Chinese imports, which basically led to China retaliating against a variety of U.S. exports. I think notwithstanding the lackluster Phase 1 agreement, which China is not even fully adhering to, tariffs are pretty much the new normal now in the U.S.-China relationship. And in my view, we've caused significant harm to the U.S. economy without gaining any of the meaningful benefits in the form of improved Chinese conduct. And I have yet to really see a case made for why this ineffective policy is continuing. I think, unfortunately, it might just be that politicians are afraid to look weak or soft on China. And so rather than having an honest debate about this policy and acknowledging that this policy is probably more painful to us than it is to the Chinese. But all of that having been said, I'm glad to have heard Mr. Williams and some of my colleagues mention that they would like to see the U.S. reconsider TPP. And in May, along with Senator Cornyn and Senator Carper, Congressman Kinzinger and I wrote to Ambassadors Hai making this argument. Basically, we wrote that the withdrawal from TPP has only served to weaken the United States, empower China, put American workers and businesses at a competitive disadvantage, and cede leadership in arguably the most strategically vital and economically dynamic region of the world. And I was glad to hear you, Mr. Williams, say that, we should engage on the things that we don't like about TPP and then figure out what to do next. And rather belabor that point, what I'd like to ask you about is, inflation is a real and serious problem. My constituents talk about it all the time. What do you think the 232 tariffs, the 301 tariffs, and Congress's failure to reauthorize GSP are taken together? How are they contributing to these higher prices for American consumers?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for a very good question. And I'd love to engage with you on the whole range of things you mentioned if we have time. But quickly on your specific question, it's very clear that all of these things are contributing to inflation together. 25% tariffs on the majority of the steel products that we import is going to significantly raise input costs. That's going to trickle through our entire economy. And so I do think, having more deals like we struck with the EU to alleviate some of that would be a good step. I think on 301, again, my view has been maybe not all these tariffs are bad. Maybe some are helpful in leverage without hurting our economy. But let's get a true assessment of that and give companies a chance to make their case. And then finally on GSP and MTB, as I mentioned in my opening, you've got over $1 billion in tariffs there. And again, this is a lot of this on both inputs to manufacturing as well as consumer-oriented products, which hurts everyday Americans. I'm happy to talk further if we get a chance.
Thank you, Mr. Williams, and I look forward to following up with you. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman Murphy. Mr. Arrington.
Chairman, thanks for the hearing. And Mr. Williams, good to see you. And lots to talk about. Probably much has already been said. And I'm trying to balance hearings like my friend Jimmy Panetta. So if I repeat some things, I apologize in advance. I agree about the human rights concerns. We have economic interest, which I think is the real battle between China and America in terms of warfare and competitiveness and global leadership. And then certainly there's a major security component. But we just keep talking about this. And I understand I'm part of this institution. After all is said and done, more is said than done. And that's the nature of this. But we have to, one thing about President Trump, and I know there's a visceral reaction to him by some of my colleagues, and I get that. Some of it he brings on himself, quite frankly. But I loved his action orientation. I think that Stephanie is right. We agree on a lot of this. We could kind of dispense with all the different unfair trade practices, the lack of accountability, and the numerous threats, and get to the point of what do we do about it, which may have more complications than I appreciate. And I don't want to oversimplify it. But at the end of the day, what is needed is, and what is lacking most in Washington, on both sides, quite frankly, is the political will to do something about it. Just do something. And I don't want to be dismissive or disparaging of my chairman, and I don't want him to take it this way, but we don't really have much of a trade agenda. I think most of that is on account of the president not having one. I mean, we benefited from you, Clete, and from President Trump actually driving hard, charging hard, and making it a priority and with Mr. Lighthizer. If you don't have that kind of leadership and urgency and prioritization in the White House, I don't know what Mr. Blumenauer or any of us can do. I mean, we can do some things, but it is significant when the USTR is empowered by the president and the president has an agenda. So we've got this major adversary out there just running roughshod, taking over and filling the void in every way with respect to the Belt and Road Initiative, Afghanistan with rare earth minerals recently, that's going to be exploited. I guarantee you, we're watching it as it plays out. No accountability for the WHO and their contributions, their carelessness at best, and at worst, their cover-up. I mean, it's just a litany of charges against what is the greatest threat existentially to the United States of America. And my frustration, with all due respect, is that we're spending all this time on actually making America less competitive with the largest tax and spend bill maybe in the history of the country. I know at one time it's hard to kind of keep up with it, but it's going to hurt our competitiveness. It's going to actually hurt labor participation because of the lack of welfare work requirements in the expansive welfare programs that are being considered. It will lower wages. It will exacerbate and increase inflation. Now, that's a hell of a strategy for trying to, compete with China. Now, I didn't even talk about the WTO reforms that we need to do there, namely the subsidies, I think is my biggest concerns. So, Clete, I thank you for your service with President Trump and the administration at USTR. I think the best contribution you could make today for all of us is to answer this fundamental question. How does one get China to change their behavior? I mean, I don't like tariffs. I don't like a lot of these other things that we've talked about, but at some point and at some level, you got to do what you got to do. It's painful, it's concerning, it's scary, but we got them to change their behavior. We're not following through on it. How do you change China's behavior? How does our chairman, our committee, and this president do that going forward? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Go ahead, Clete.
Well, thank you very much. Ms. Sanchez.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, would you mind letting him answer the question or?
You concluded your question when your time expired.
Okay, well, I thank you for that consideration. I rest my case. I rest my case.
Ms. Sanchez.
Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, for the opportunity to focus on what is a very important and a very timely issue. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Congressional Labor Caucus and a former labor attorney, and I strongly believe in the importance of putting workers first. And that's why I'm a strong advocate for a worker-centric approach to trade that helps working families both at home and abroad. As our expert witnesses have testified, the evidence of forced labor in China is clear. It's deplorable. It's a violation of basic human rights. And quite frankly, it's unacceptable. The Uyghur people have suffered immensely because of coerced participation in the Chinese government's so-called poverty alleviation programs, which are basically just a very thinly and poorly disguised way of forcing labor. We have to do everything that we can to try to fight forced labor because not only is it, antithetical to basic human rights, but it also undermines our ability to compete on a fair and level playing field. We need to ensure that all workers can pursue their careers with basic dignity in place. And I have to say that I am encouraged by the steps that the Biden administration has taken to try to combat forced labor. These actions include issuing withhold release orders and updating the Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child and forced labor to include items made by the Uyghur people who are forced into forced labor. I'm very proud that our committee has worked across the aisle on trade issues, but we urgently need a coherent, a consistent, and most importantly, an enforceable approach to China. We have to build on our accomplishments and try to deliver higher labor standards and meaningful enforcement in our trade agreements, because if we cannot, do the basic thing of enforcing the agreements that we've signed, it pretty much makes them not worth the paper that they're written on. Mr. Hausman, I want to thank you for your efforts to defend American workers. As you mentioned, enforcement is critical to our trade agenda, and it doesn't matter how high we set standards for labor if we can't hold other nations to those standards. Can you speak more as to how China has managed to evade tariffs and undermine our standards? And as their efforts get more sophisticated, how can we be proactive in preventing them from circumventing our trade laws?
Sure. I think, the first step here is really looking at a worker-centered trade agenda, as you've indicated here. I mean, this is a policy realignment that is over 20 years in the making. I mean, USW highlighted in 2000 that, the addition to China and the permanent PNTR status was going to, increase the trade deficit and increase lost jobs. And we've seen that very much happen. And so this is not just about forced labor. It's about the labor rights and the labor conditions and environmental conditions that we expect our trading partners to adhere to as well. And I think that's why, for example, the EU and US 232 deal is a prime example of an opportunity to re-engage and improve not just working conditions for US and European workers, through items like a melt and pour standard, requiring that the steel and aluminum, or the steel, actually be melted and poured here in the US or the EU to qualify for trade between the two countries. But also the idea of environmental standards, holding accountable these ideas of high carbon intensity in countries like China and others, to trying to prevent our trade policy from increasing greenhouse gas emissions. So there's this opportunity to create a power in trade policy, and it takes time to develop. And this is why this hearing and what you guys are kind of going back and forth on here is important. And that we look back on what wasn't working in the TPP and why are we working so hard to create an expedited trade authority when we were able, with the USMCA agreement, to get wide bipartisan margins through universal support by both near universal support by both Democrats and Republicans. So building on what we've developed through the last Congress and building out those labor provisions in a way that ensures that we have an independent labor movement. I think back, what was one of the big things that felled communism was an independent solidarity movement by the Polish workers. And I think that that's something to think about, is it's independent workers' rights that really can push and provide an opportunity for democracy to thrive.
Thank you so much. I have very limited time, but I would be remiss if I didn't recognize Ms. Glass. I worked with her when she was on the Hill. It's great to see you again. And I'll take your answer in writing, but I'm going to pose the question. In your testimony, you indicated that China's unfair trade practices are a contributing factor to migration flows in CAFTA countries. I'm interested in knowing what policies you believe would help grow jobs and production in Central America and provide economic stability to workers who might otherwise seek to migrate to the U.S. And as I said, we're out of time for you to answer that now, but I would appreciate an answer in writing.
Absolutely, and wonderful to see you again.
Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Sanchez. And I would be interested in her response to you if you think about it. Congressman Beyer.
I'll find the unmute button. Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer. Thank you so much for putting this together. I confess I've been progressively depressed through the last 2.5 hours of this hearing. And I would just for a minute, without being a China apologist, because I am not, but I do want to point out all the strengths that we have. We have a democracy, not an authoritarian government. We have, leaders chosen by our people who aren't in fear of being overthrown. We have a country where everyone in the world wants to move here, including Chinese, and no one wants to move to China. They have the 421 aging problem where they get older and older and older, and we're just about to make the most significant investment in our children that we've ever done. And we have the best human capital in the world. Just look at Nobel Prizes here versus there. Yes, they are a great threat, economically especially, but I please don't want us to despair. I don't think they're the greatest existential threat to the U.S. I know as politicians we need enemies, but whatever. Let me move on. Mr. Williams, there's a lot of talk about CPTPP, and I agree with my pal Ron Kind that the greatest strategic economic mistake of this century has been pulling out of TPP. You wrote about we should get back into CPTPP if it were not a political impossibility. Why should it be a political impossibility? Why can't we move forward on this?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. And first, let me compliment you on your introductory remarks. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the American model is the best model in the world. And as we're trying to fight China, I've always said we shouldn't become China to beat China. We should double down on our own strengths. And so I just want to compliment you on that. In terms of your second question, or your question, look, it's clear today. I am a big fan of CPTPP. I think we should get back in the game. I think we should renegotiate the aspects of it that people think need to change. But I am fearful that at this point in time, there isn't the political will from the administration to do that. And I am just trying to recognize reality and say that as a less desirable alternative, they could look at just doing a digital trade agreement or something like that, but that would not be my preference. I hope that this hearing today and the conversations we're having on a bipartisan basis will actually encourage them to show that the support is there on both sides of the aisle. And so I think it's important that we continue to illustrate that to them. And again, I think some of my other witnesses have mentioned things that need to change. Let's talk about those and let's figure out a way to change them so we can get back.
Maybe we can together build the political will to make that happen. Dr. Mallory, would it help us at all in our struggles with China over fisheries if we endorse the law of the sea treaty, if we ratified that?
Yes, I think that would be a great step. I mean, obviously the United States abides by UNCLOS as customary law, but China takes every opportunity it can get to point out the hypocrisy of the United States for not actually ratifying UNCLOS while they have.
And one of the things you wrote a lot about is the amazing Chinese subsidies for fishing. And I just read that a third of the world's fisheries right now are endangered, that they're beyond their biological limits. How much does China contribute to the overfishing of our oceans?
I mean, it has the largest fishing fleet in the world. So, its own coastal waters are heavily overfished. And then it's, really working up the capacity to fish more on the high seas because a lot of the high seas is not regulated. So they are a big contributor, and they're also, they make a big contribution through the processing. So a lot of countries will send their fish to China to be processed. And so, I think it's important for us to think about, where we get our seafood from and not be indirectly supporting the labor abuses, because we are buying seafood from China that has, leaked in through other sources that are illegal and unreported, unregulated fishing.
Thank you. And Mr. Williams, just a quick question. You talked about the reinvigorated 301 tariff exclusion process. I hear about specifically from companies that are working on the climate agenda. Can you talk about the perspective of easing tariffs on those goods, especially as we continue to face the supply chain disruptions?
I think it's a good point. And we talked a lot about costs. We talked about inflation and things like that. But I think we also need to look at the 301 tariffs in terms of how they affect our supply chain goals and how they affect our broader climate goals, and would looking targeted tariff exceptions on products that are important to those objectives, would that also help us? And I do think that that is something that the Biden administration could put into its criteria if it so chose, if it adopted a new process.
Great. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back with thanks.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sewell.
Thank you. Yes.
We appreciate your contribution here with the introduction of your legislation dealing with how we solve some of these intractable problems and improving on our friends in the Senate.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership and for your continued spotlight on unfair trade practices. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to participate in today's hearing. Just a few weeks ago, the Biden administration took a major step to combat China's growing influence by passing the historic Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. By modernizing our infrastructure for the 21st century and investing in working families, America will be better positioned to compete with China for decades to come. As we continue to build back better, we must also continue to develop a work-centered trade agenda. I couldn't agree more with Ms. Sanchez to combat China's forced labor practices, unfair industrial subsidies, and China's steel overcapacity. I know firsthand how China's steel overcapacity has hurt steel workers and steel manufacturers. In my district, in 2016, a steel manufacturing facility in Fairfield, Alabama, was forced to downsize after China's steel overcapacity devastated the global market for domestic steel producers. Congress must do more to combat China's anti-free market practices and ensure that our steel workers can compete on a level playing field. That is why I am proud today to introduce with Representative Bill Johnson the Level the Playing Field Act 2.0. This targeted bill will modernize our anti-dumping and countervailing duty protections to combat China's Belt and Road Initiative subsidies, prevent China's circumvention of U.S. laws, and penalize repeat offenders by expediting successive investigations to stop country hopping and duty evasion. These are common sense bipartisan solutions to protect American workers and get tough on China's anti-market practices. My questions are for you, Mr. Hausman. Mr. Hausman, how have the steel workers been impacted by some of the current loopholes in our anti-dumping and counter duty laws? And how do you think that some of the improvements in the Level of Playing Field 2.0 Act would help steel workers in my district and across the United States? Likewise, can you elaborate on how China's Belt and Road Initiative is challenging our current trade enforcement laws? Thanks.
Yes, well, thank you, Representative Sewell. Really appreciate the question. And I think it's really important that we have indicated that bad actors like China and unscrupulous importers, they've targeted weaknesses in our trade enforcement laws. They've looked for pathways to dump and subsidize goods into the market, capture market share, and put hardworking Americans out of work, as you've indicated with Fairfield Works USS. You know, we've been participants with multiple AD/CVD cases to defend that plant from unfair trade practices. And that's what, and one of the reasons why we've been supportive of 232 duties as well, is which allowed that Fairfield Works facility to reinvest and build in an electric arc furnace, which is efficient and able to produce high quality steel. But for the Leveling the Playing Field Act 2.0, this opportunity here is to help instruct the International Trade Commission to consider previous successful petitions in a more meaningful way. This will save workers and employers resources so that they're spending more money rebuilding plants and not fighting and paying for lawyers, which, there's lots of wonderful lawyers out there, but it's an opportunity for us to focus on the most important thing that these companies want to do, and that's make a product. So, there's an opportunity here to address subsidies from third-party countries by the increased imports into the U.S. from provisions and recognize anti-competitive foreign direct investments, which undermine U.S. markets. And like when China's Belt and Road Initiative subsidizes and benefits China's based companies and companies operating outside of China. And ultimately, this is something that we have to work really diligently on. When you look at, for example, there's a new trade case on freight rail couplers. And the Commerce Department is having to review and ensure that each of the components are, not only we're stopping imports from China, but that those components aren't being assembled and then shipped into the market from Mexico or Canada, which would undermine the ability of those duties to work. So your legislation's right spot on and helped guide Commerce and the International Trade Commission to moving forward. And USW obviously supports the Senate version, and we're likely to get a letter up there shortly in support of your legislation as well.
Thank you, Mr. Hausman. Do you believe that giving the administration authority to apply countervailing duty laws to subsidies provided by a government to a company operating in a different country would help combat China's growing influence around the world?
Absolutely. I mean, this idea of third-party subsidization is something that we really do have to address. I mean, I've mentioned it in regards to the General Systems Preference Program, but also just generally, it's, China's outbound growth is designed not just to as a tool for goodwill, and it's also designed to target U.S. manufacturers and U.S. companies.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all witnesses. I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and hopefully across the aisle. I think these are common sense solutions that should garner bipartisan support. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more, Congressman Sewell, and I look forward to working with you and our other colleagues to integrate this into our efforts as soon as possible. Thank you. Dr. Weinstraub, do we still have you? Congressman Swayze, Governor. Tom? Congressman Smucker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
You bet.
All right. Thank you for doing this hearing. This has been a great discussion. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for your testimonies this morning. Appreciate you sharing recommendations on the trade tools that we can use to better position U.S. businesses and employees against China's unfair trade practices. It's been interesting serving on Ways and Means. It's been a tough year in terms of the partisanship we've seen on the committee. So it's been refreshing to be in a hearing where there's so many comments that were made by members on both sides of the aisle I can agree with. And I'd like to get back to something that Representative Beyer said. It's often amazing to me at how people look at the bad side of things and don't realize the good that we have and how our country is doing better than in generations before. And so I agree with him in that regard, but I also think we have to be clear-eyed about the threats and about the policies that we are implementing that could potentially change that for future generations. And just a little aside, we've had a lot of discussion on this committee about our economic policy, about our economic system. And I fear today the direction that Democrats are taking the country into more of a European Democrat socialist model will impact that ability for future generations to do better than generations before them. I believe in the ingenuity and the creativity of the American people. And I think, to Mr. Beyer's point, that is why we are the envy of the world. That's why everyone from across the country wants to move here. So I'm fighting to preserve that economic system. And this gets to China. And Mr. Willems, I want to refer to some of the comments that you made in your testimony and think about this in a little broader context. And that is China's efforts to surpass the U.S., not only in trade policy, but also in the economic system, in its system of government, and even militarily. And you mentioned, Mr. Willems, in your written comments, I'm not sure if you mentioned it in your testimony today, but how important it is for us to consider trade policy in that context. And yes, we are the best system in the face of the earth, but China certainly wants to overtake the United States as a superpower in the world and potentially has the capacity to do that. So I think we have to take that very, very seriously and see them as probably the top threat, at least externally, to the country. So I wonder if you could expand just a little on that. And you also said, and you just mentioned this a little earlier, and you say in your testimony as well, you said, we don't want to attempt to become China to beat China. So I'm just curious what you mean when you talk about that.
Sure, Congressman, happy to elaborate. And I agree with you about the need to be clear-eyed on China and the threat that it poses. And I do think that one thing we've lacked, and this is maybe a critique of both parties, is a comprehensive strategic vision of all the different things we're going to do to counter them and how that all fits together. And that's the spirit of my testimony today, is to try to start getting us thinking in those terms and provide that. And so obviously that does include things that refer to pushing back to China directly, trade agreements, defensive measures, and things like that. But the question you're asking about is a point that I made in my testimony, and that's that I think, given the existential threat that China poses, given the fact that China represents a completely different, and their government, right? I think someone earlier made a really good comment distinguishing the government from the people. So here I'm talking about the government. The government represents totalitarianism, authoritarianism. It represents censorship. It's not a democratic system. It's not a free market system. It doesn't give people rights the way that we do. And so in my mind, that is an existential threat. And we need to think about everything we do in terms of, is it contributing to our ability to promote our model over theirs, or is it hindering it? And some of the things I referenced that I am concerned about are some of the efforts to raise taxes, to increase regulation, and some of the legislation, the anti-competition legislation that's being considered, where we're really targeting our own technology leaders who are going heads up with China, and we're going to put restrictions on them that would make them much less competitive with China and give China an advantage. And I think we need to think broader when we're doing those things. Yes, we may have legitimate objectives, but let's think about how it affects that existential competition with China.
Thank you. Would love to continue that discussion. I'm already out of time, but thanks for your comments, Mr. Willems.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. And I think that is part of the basis that we would like to have going forward. I appreciated the question and the answer. Governor Strausse, I see you joined us.
Thank you for the promotion, Earl. I appreciate that.
Well, we'll miss you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks so much to the witnesses. Chairman, thanks so much for doing this hearing. Listen, I'm going to say some things that I say often on this same topic, which is that ever since President Nixon went to China, we thought that the more that the Chinese people and government were exposed to us, the more they'd become like us. They'd adopt our ideas regarding capitalism. They'd adopt our ideas regarding democracy. And as we know, that just simply hasn't happened. And they have decided that their system is the best system. As the previous witness was just talking about, authoritarianism, totalitarianism. They cheat as far as trade practices go. They steal ideas from us. And they treat their own people awful, whether it's the students in Hong Kong or the jailing of people for speaking out, or the way they've treated the Tibetans over the years. And a big focus of mine, I'm the chairman of the Uyghur Caucus. I encourage all my colleagues to join the Uyghur Caucus. These are folks in the Xinjiang region that are in forced labor camps. Both the previous administration and this administration have described it as crimes against humanity and genocide. There's forced sterilization. Muslim people are being forced to eat pork. They're being forced to eat during Ramadan when they're supposed to be fasting. So it's just awful what the Chinese Communist Party is doing to their people to try and create a homogeneous society and to root out any of the religious minorities that exist in their country. So we need to combat that. And we've been focused, now from the 70s with Nixon, in the 80s, we saw our competition from Japan and Germany, and we said, listen, we have to be more effective competing internationally. We were worried about the car industry at the time, and we did a lot more globalization. We relied on technology, and we just started searching for the best way to make profits and to find goods the cheapest. And We found a lot of cheap goods in a lot of places in the world, but one place was from China. Now, 22% of the world's cotton products come from the Xinjiang region of China, and I know that Ms. Glass is on this hearing as well, and the textile industry is very concerned about what China is doing. So we've gone to China for cheaper goods. If we close down the market, which I would think we should do from the Xinjiang region, we have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. We should say that any goods coming from the Xinjiang region are presumed to be being made with forced labor. And there's concerns from industry and others that this will make the cost of our shirts and our pants and other things go up in cost, and it'll be passed on to the consumer. And my initial reaction to that is it's too damn bad, because we have to hold them accountable for the way that they're treating human beings in their country. But another thing that I've spoken about, and I'd like to hear what Ms. Glass has to say from the textile industry, is I think that we should do the Forced Labor Prevention Act. We should stop importing goods from China, including cotton and other goods. And as a result, we have to find new markets for that. And some of the things we'll be able to do in the U.S., but other things we have to do with other allies of ours that we want to try and build our relationships with or share our values. I think this is an opportunity for us to try and promote cotton production, textile production in Central America, especially in Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala. And that would help us with those countries having more jobs available for people, of course, pursuant to our trade agreements and making sure that they're protecting the rights of their working people and protecting the environment, et cetera. But let's move the market from China and move it to places that we want to try and help in our hemisphere, and also hopefully address the immigration problem in the process. I'd love to know what Ms. Glass thinks about that idea. Am I crazy, or is that yes?
You're not crazy, and it's music to our ears, the things that you're saying here, and it's so nice to see you again. I couldn't agree with all of your recommendations more. And in fact, I serve as a commissioner on the bipartisan U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. And one of the recommendations of the commission this year is to ban all products coming from Xinjiang for importation to the U.S. market. But long story short, Congressman, 70% of U.S. textile fiber, yarns, and fabrics go to our Western Hemisphere trade partners. We have one of the best cotton industries, growing industries in the world. There is transparency in our supply chains here in the hemisphere because we have strong rules of origin under our free trade agreements. We're already starting to see opportunities come to the hemisphere. Trade is up from some of the Northern Triangle countries by 56% over the last 2 years because Asian supply chains are breaking down. And I do think that there are retailers who are trying to de-risk out of Asia, given the pervasiveness of the Xinjiang cotton issues. Our market is open here in the United States, and we're open for business in the Western Hemisphere. And this is a huge opportunity to onshore and nearshore these critical production chains.
Thank you, Kimberly. So let's try and build bipartisan support. Let's shut down cotton coming from China, from the Xinjiang region, and start getting that cotton and those cotton goods from the Northern Triangle, where we have other issues that can be improved by doing so. And I'd love to get Mr. Williams to support that idea, as well as the Republican witness here. But I see that my time has expired. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it.
Well, we're glad that you could join us, Tom. We're going to try and get as much out of you as we can in this last year when you're on the committee. I want to thank all of our witnesses for their time today and the work on our trade relationship with China. I really found the written testimony and the comments and the back and forth with the Q&A extraordinarily helpful. We've highlighted some of the issues that we face, the opportunities in Congress. Mr. Beyer, I appreciated his 1 minute soliloquy on what we've got going for us. Sometimes we forget that in terms of the strength of the American economy, the approach that we have that I think ultimately will prove superior to what we face with China. But we have not just short-term, but intermediate-term issues meeting with them. As we work with the Biden administration moving forward in hopefully a more constructive era, I look forward to the opportunity for us all to develop a comprehensive and effective China strategy that really supports our interests, our workers, our business, the environment, and our values. I think there's broad public acceptance for an approach like this, and there could be bipartisan support with some of the areas that we talked about today. I would like to continue the dialogue with our witnesses in the future. I welcome you. We normally have members given 2 weeks to submit written questions to our witnesses, but I would appreciate not only any answers you may have from members of the committee, but I would welcome any additional thoughts you might have reflecting on the direction of the committee, other things that have perhaps occurred to you that might sharpen the focus to be able to do this as comprehensively and as quickly as possible. Time is of the essence, and I think given some of the pending items of legislation,